Hi guys, welcome to COSC210 lab session number 5, and in today's lab session we're going to be looking at the PGSQL scripting language for creating stored procedures within our database. So just before we get started on today's practical exercise, first thing we need to do is set up a database for today's prac, and we're going to do that by first creating a new database as we normally have been, but then we're going to do a dump of the P1 Booktown database into our Prac5 database. So that's the database that you are working on in the first practical assignment, and you can grab that from the P1 Booktown.sql file. So when you go and grab that database, you should be able to just run that script to create all of your tables, and I've already done that. So I've got my ML8 Booktown database already created, ready to go for this prac. So first of all, we're going to start by introducing some of the concepts surrounding PL/PGSQL. So in the previous lab session, we looked at connecting up the Postgres database management system to some data-driven applications. Now, this allows us to essentially combine our database with a program that's written in a general-purpose programming language, and we saw that we can use this approach to essentially interact with the database, carry out some processing on the client side, and then send data and information back to the server by carrying out queries. Now, so some of the problems with this are certainly we end up with a situation where we have a lot of communication going on between the client and the server. So it means that our client application has to send each query to the database server, wait for it to be processed, and then receive the results, do some computation, and then send further queries to the server. So essentially there's this constant stream of round trips between the different blocks, between the different information. So in order to eliminate some of these round trips, we can create simple stored procedures that can be executed on the database server side. So effectively, these stored procedures allow us to perform procedural language operations on the server side through the SQL language. So we define these procedures and then we can trigger them off. So these essentially allow us to avoid extra round trips between the client and the server, and they allow us to essentially set up so that intermediate results don't need to be transferred between the client and the server. So we can also remove multiple rounds of query passing, and essentially we can increase the performance. So the idea of these PGSQL statements is that they allow us to do more processing on the database side. So I'm going to start by going through some of the basics. So in this initial example, we're going to create our first PGSQL function. So you can see to do this, we have a basic definition statement. Now these are similar to the statements that we've seen when we've been creating tables and we've been creating views. Essentially we have the keywords create function, we give our function a name, now we can specify some parameters, and we can specify a return type. Then between these double $signs, we specify the body of our function. So we declare any variables underneath our declare keyword. Then our procedure begins at the begin keyword and it ends at the end keyword. So we can see here we have an example of our hello world function. So we've got our create function, we've given our function a name, we've said that it's returning a varchar type, and we place our begin and end block between our $signs, and we specify that the language is PGSQL. So if we go and create this function, so we're going to create a function called hello in our database. We can do that by jumping down here and just pasting that one in. When we do that, we've got this, our prompt has returned the create function prompt, and now we can engage that function by using a select query. So if we select hello from our database, you can see that we get one row of data returned, and it contains the result of our function. So our select clause returns a single column that contains the result of our initial function call. Now, we can make our functions do all sorts of processing. This next example shows the use of a declare block where we declare some variables. So again, we have our create function keywords. we give our function a name, and we specify a return type. We then include a declare block. So you can see in the hello world example, we didn't need any variables, so we didn't have a declare block. In this one, we're declaring values 1, 2, and 3. A little note here is that the assignment operator in PGSQL is the colon equals, so we're assigning some values using this operator to value 1, 2, and 3. And we specify that the type of the value, the type of our variable, after we specify the name. So you can see here we actually grab our values, we reassign some data to them, and we print them out. So if we go and copy our code for this one, drop it into our sample database over here, we can run through our code, and again we can engage that function by using the select, and we'll select add underscore func. When we do that, we get a result of 15, which makes sense because we've declared these variables and we've immediately changed the value and returned. We've used the return statement to return value number 3. So this is an example of assignment, simple mathematical operation. So as I pointed out before, note that the assignment operator is the colon equals operator, not just the equals alone operator. Now we can pass parameters into our newly created functions by specifying a comma-separated list that contains the names and the types after the function name. So we do that by, again, using the create function statement, and we then give our function a name. We then have our parentheses, and between them we have our comma-separated list of parameters. And we can see here we've specified our return type to be an integer. So everything between the dollar signs specifies our function, and here we're returning the sum of 2 numbers. So when we can go and create this function, and when we call it, we'll have to substitute in some of our some values for those parameters. So we've created our function, so now we can engage our function yet again by using the select statement. So we're engaging a sum of 2 numbers. Now we need to pass in some parameters, so recall that it's fine to just pass in parameters as you normally would when we're working with SQL statements that call on a function. So remember we looked at using simple functions back in practicals 2 and 3. This function that you have created is no different. We simply pass in some parameters and it'll go through and execute the code with those parameters in place. Now, PGSQL procedures can execute queries that manipulate data within the database, and really this is the whole point of these functions. So far we've only looked at some toy examples, but when we want to really do some intermediate processing, we're going to need to start manipulating our data. So following function example we've got will return the full name of an author by the author ID. Now a variable can actually be created for the row types that we're going to access. So if we look at the syntax down here, we've specified that we've created a variable. So in here, we've specified that our author ID is going to be our first parameter. So our first parameter is being used, we've specified using this placeholder value, and we've specified an alias for that first parameter called auth ID. So here on the second item that we've declared, we've created a variable named found author, and it's actually going to be of the type for the row type in authors. So if we look at if we consider all of the attributes from the authors table, so if we go and grab, for example, select star from authors, you can see that an authors table, the authors table has three attributes listed in here. Now we can create a variable that'll store a single row of data from that table by using this syntax here. We put this %sign and specify that the authors, we're using the authors table row type. Now when we do this, we can use the select into syntax to select in items into that variable according to our where clause here, and then all we do is simply we're returning the first name concatenated to the last name. So our getAuthor function will return a list of all authors by first of all selecting each row into our variable and then using the first name and last name fields from our found authors variable in a string concatenation operation. So recall that the concatenation operator for Postgres is the double pipe operator, and it'll return that item for each row that's returned in our query here. And you can see that by specifying the author ID, so you can see here author ID is being used down in our query, we're only going to get one row returned. So if we go through and create our get author function, oops, sorry, I haven't copied that correctly. We've created our function, and if we engage our function, so I'm going to run through the example we've got here, we're going to be grabbing the author with an ID of 16. So when we do this, you can see that we get the result returned. So essentially, we're doing some small amount of processing according to a query here and returning the row. So we've eliminated needing to do that particular processing on the client side. Now we can achieve a very similar scenario by using just the query without the function, but we're going to slowly start building up some more complex functions as we move down through. So in our more complicated example, we can search for a specific author by the first name and throw an exception if the author isn't returned. So here we're specifying a new function using our create function syntax. We've given it the name test1. We've specified a text parameter, and we're saying that it's returning. We're telling the interpreter that we're returning a text type value. We're then declaring a single variable, and it's going to be of the author's row type. So again, it's going to have a first name, last name, and also an ID field there. So it'll hold a single row from the authors table. We then carry out our select query, and again, we're selecting all columns into our found author variable, where our first name equals first name, and we have this little line where it says if not found, then we're using the raise exception keyword to throw an exception. So if we go through, otherwise it'll return the text OK. So if we go through, we can create this function in our database and drop that one in here. We've created our function, and again we can engage that function. So we can select those functions through, and that will allow us to select start from, oops, it should just be select test1, sorry, test1, and our first name, so we're going to grab Louisa May here as our example. Drop that one in. You can see that it's returned OK because that author does exist. If we go through and select an author that doesn't, oh, we've got somebody in there that matches that one. You can see that we get an error returned if we just drop a random string in there. So that just gives us a nice example of how we can retrieve data from our database and raise an exception if we don't have anything returned through there. So the syntax is a little bit confronting, but when you start pulling it apart, you can see that all we're doing is creating a row-typed variable that holds a single row of data from our authors table. We're going through and selecting that row of data into our variable and then accessing the various items in that data. So we're accessing the first name and the last name items in there. PLPGSQL has a full set of control structures, so we can both use selection and iteration. We have our normal if-then-else structure. We also have a case structure to implement selection, and we can implement iteration using our loop structure. So here we have some examples of using our selection case. So we're using an if-then-else statement to determine if the current date is the first of the month. So here we've got an example where we're creating our function yet again. We've given it a name, and we're taking in a single date type, and we're returning a text type. So it'll either return first day of the month or other day. Now, if we go through, we can again go and create our function. So remember, we always have to define our function before we can use it. So we define our function, and we can even test that against our current date. So if we go through, jump through our current date, we can, oops, paste that in. That's not what I wanted, sorry. Drop that one in. You can see that it's another day, but if we put the date in, if we put a date compatible string in here, so if we put the first 2016 into here, you can see that it'll return the first, it'll specify that it's the first day of the month, because we're using the extract function to pull the day from our current date. So there's some interesting syntax there just to demonstrate how to use those select structures. We can do similar options when we're with our case function. So essentially here we're creating a function called odd or even in this example that takes a single parameter named x, and it'll return true if it's either, it'll return even, and even the message, assign the value of even number to the message variable if it's in this list. Otherwise, it's in this list, it'll assign the text value as an odd number. So as you can see here, we've declared our message to be a text type in our declare block. We're going down, we're using this, and we're returning this at the end of our, just before the end of our statements, our begin and end block. We're just returning that as the final statement. So here we're using the in operator to check which list of numbers parameter x resides in. So this one's a little bit more tricky. And again, we're using this this list syntax to search through and find those items. So the final set of examples that we're going to be looking at here today use iteration. Again, we've got our while loop and our for loop. So the while loop is used to iterate until some condition is met. And the for loop is used to iterate over rows of data from a query. So if we look at our first table here, first example, you can see again we're creating a function. We're naming that function while underscore cube, and it takes a single integer. Now, you'll notice that again, we haven't given this parameter a name. So that means that it'll automatically reside within the $1 variable, and we can give this, we're using the alias syntax here to name this variable, to give it an alias nm. We're then going and declaring an integer called cub or cube. We're declaring that as an integer type. So we start off by assigning the value of our integer to cube, and while it's less, while cube is equal to or less than 10,000, we're going through and performing this operation. So we're cubing it up to 10,000 and then returning the result at the end. So if we go and run this one, you can see that we are, in this example, we're using iteration. So we paste this one in, created our function, and if we go select while cube, we can run that. So we'll put 4 in there. Oops. What have we done here? Did we create our function? We have created our function. Why are we not working? Why is this one not working for me? Hi guys, sorry for that one. I just dropped the E off there. So if we use the right name for our function, you can see that immediately we get our cube, we get the result of our cube back. So we find our cube to the first 10,000, find the 10th to the 10,000th value there. So essentially, we are running through and looping through and performing that operation. So it's just a nice little example to show the use of iteration. So the final example is a far more useful one, and here we have we're using a for loop to iterate over each row of data returned by a query. So you can see that our function, we've given our function a name called author names. It doesn't take any arguments, any parameters rather. So we're just going to declare a text type value, and we're assigning the new line character to that one, and we're creating an author's row type variable. So we're creating a variable to hold a single row of data, and we go through and first of all we select all of our authors and we order them by first name, and we select those into our row data using the in syntax here. So we're performing our query, selecting that into our row data variable, and we're then constructing our output text variable, which will consist of each item. So we're iterating through for each row of data. We're concatenating output text to the first name and the last name, and we're also concatenating a new line character. So we're going to get a list of the first and last names to be printed out and returned by this function. So if I jump in, I can execute this one as a quick demo. So if I paste that one in, you can see that we'll just go select author underscore names. We don't need to pass anything in. You can see that we get a nice big long list. My console has chosen not to interpret the new line characters, but when you print that out in a text editor, it'll look a lot nicer, because the text editor will respect the new line characters. So this is really just a whirlwind tour of our PLPGSQL functions in Postgres. You've got a couple of exercises here to complete. The first one, you'll have to go and enter in a couple of lines of text. So we're going to create a function called extract title. It accepts a single integer type parameter containing the subject ID and returns a string that contains a comma separated list of titles of all books that correspond to the ID. So you've got to go through and carry out a query. So you've got to select, we're selecting our row data into each item where they're equal to the subject ID, and you've got to go and do the concatenation bit of this one, and you've also got to declare a text type variable to concatenate everything too. So you'll be pretty much doing what we did up here, only you'll be returning a comma separated list. The second exercise is a little bit more in depth. In here, you'll be constructing a PLPGSQL function called inStock that accepts two integer parameters that contain the book ID and the edition, and it'll return the Boolean value of either true or false, indicating if the book is in stock. So here, all we're doing is really returning true or false. So it's a really simple function in the end, but essentially we've got to go through a series of steps here, and this one's slightly more complicated. So we've got to select this will be a select into statement that retrieves the ISBN number of the row in the editions table that had a book with the ID number and edition number that's provided. So we're selecting that one into there. You've just got to complete that query, and then you've got to go through and carry out this little check, and by the end you'll end up with a nice query that will return the true or false if the stock amount is greater than 0. So this second one is an advanced level exercise. It's quite challenging, so don't be afraid if you find that one difficult. So with these statements, you won't be expected to know PLPGSQL for your exam, but this just gives you a nice intro to the use of stored procedures. So that's all I've got for today's practical session, guys. Thanks for listening.